Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Kiangoi wash processed Kenya from Calendar Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Calendar, based out of Galway, Ireland, and they're easily our most featured Irish coffee roaster on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster that's been extremely accessible to us over the last few years. This coffee caught my interest because my buddy Zach has been raving about how good Calendar's Kenyan coffees are over the last few years. So this felt like a great opportunity to try one out for ourselves, as this right here is day 39. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which typically indicates a more medium grind. We did go a little bit more fine on the grind for this one as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, as we've alluded to in previous Calendar reviews, they are one of the lightest roasting coffee roasters between England and Ireland, and you can definitely tell that this one is still on the lighter side of things, and at times it reminds me a little bit of some of Kopi's coffees that we have, which is to say that it's a pretty light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all of that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and it felt like a lot of what we might expect from a Kenyan coffee from Calendar, as it offered a nice bit of sweetness with a slightly honey and pastry scents to the cup, classic bright tart berry profile, and it was at times almost reminiscent of what I would describe as a berry pie. So a lot of positives to take away from that. Pretty clean, bright, vibrant, and a nice start in general. Day 17 opted for the Chemex with a potential brewing error, as I felt like it was possibly slightly over-extracted with a strong bitterness from the cup. That's going to be kind of interesting going forward, but the brightness is still there with an uneven sense of this lingering tart berry in the background, and I couldn't help but feel like maybe we actually had a slight bit of an error on this day. Continue on to day 19 as we opted for the April brewer, and things felt a little bit more normal, as it reminded me of what I would describe as a blackberry jam feel and sweetness to the cup. Plenty of body and texture with a lingering sweetness and a moderate to high Kenyan brightness. In addition to that, there's a little bit of a lingering honey bitterness to the cup as well. A good day nonetheless, as that bitterness once again is something that I took note of, and I said, okay, we've had a couple of days where I've experienced this, but let's see what happens with some adjustments. Day 22, and this is when I started to wonder whether or not it was actually a brewing error, as there was a very strong zinginess in the cup that I would describe as being reminiscent of a super herbal citrus. And then the best descriptor I would say was bergamot, with a heavily pronounced component in the finish, of course in line with that spiced quality. Plenty of Kenyan brightness as well, and it's on this day where I really started to wonder what on earth is going on with this coffee. And then I read the description of this coffee, and I think that they had something along the lines of hops or a hoppiness to this one, and I said, okay, well that kind of explains everything. When I looked at the two notes that they have on the front of this bag, I was fully expecting a very straightforward Kenyan coffee, and when I was getting this very strong bitterness to it, that was, well, to be honest, pretty hopsy. I didn't necessarily understand where that was coming from, but when I read on the actual description of the coffee itself that you're experiencing that hoppiness to it, I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'm experiencing the way that this coffee is actually supposed to be. Day 25 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and interestingly, it had notably less of that bergamot-like feel to it, but more of a candied focus on the dark berry aspects. And this is the first time I said, okay, I think I'm starting to get where this coffee is going. At times reminiscent of blackberry hard candy in both a honey and herbal sense. Cup is offering plenty of depth, and at this moment I felt like it was the best experience I'd had of it that far. And then day 29, back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the struggles continued, and I started to notice that a lot of my struggles were coming from this brew method. Even the first day that I had brewed it, I said it's nice, but I think it's maybe lacking something a little unique or stand-outish about it. In addition to that, there's a little bit more of that bitter floral honey side of things with the dark hard candy aspect. Cup felt a little soft, but it does open up a bit more as it cools down, with the tart berries a little bit more pronounced in that sense. Day 32, back through the Chemex with the higher extraction adjustments once again, and it was back to being its best, as it was offering more balance to the classic Kenyan attributes in a cleaner sense, slight dark gummy sweetness with a better balanced citrus and plum-like attributes to it. Really enjoyed the way that the coffee was on that day and on day 35. another try through the Chemex, and we are getting some pretty similar experiences from that previous day 32 mark, as it offers more of the hard candy and gummy-like sweetness to the classic tart berry characteristics. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we will start with the cleanliness level 4. And that's always a big deal when it comes to Kenyan coffees for me, scoring at that level 4 mark, as oftentimes if they're too savory, then I will kind of score them down for that. But this one right here didn't necessarily offer too many of those tomato-like characteristics. I do think that they did a very nice job of maybe subduing a lot of those things, as the savoriness still scores at level 2, but for the most part, it's skewed a little bit more on the cleaner side of things. I think it's because it focused a bit more on the candied attributes of this one. So level 4 seems like a good fit. Finish level 4, once again, since it's a washed Kenyan coffee, I'll just kind of lump that and the acidity together, because if they're not scoring that level 4, then something's very off with this coffee, and either I did something very wrong or somebody did something very wrong, because both of those should always at minimum score that level 4 mark. Classic, we have a fair bit of that tart berry finish to this one, and both those things definitely scored that level 4 mark. Sweetness, level 4. I do have to say that I struggled with this coffee a lot of the time to get it to that level 4 mark, especially with the V60. For whatever reason, the Chemex really seemed to accentuate a lot more of those candied qualities to it. It wasn't an easy level 4 to achieve, but I think it's maybe a little bit more of a true level 4 than I might have expected after some of the initial impressions of this one. Plurality, level 4. And this is probably one of the slightly more interesting parts of this coffee, because it was a little bit more of a honey florality as opposed to what I might expect as a either rose or hibiscus-like florality that I typically experience with these Kenyan coffees. Typically when they offer that red characteristic to them and a floral sense, and those two things seem to go together. But I've said in the past with a lot of Calendar's coffees that they do have that honey-like aspect to them, sometimes extremely strong in terms of that honeyed sense. And given that I was picking that up from this coffee, it's what I alluded to on our first day, that it felt like a Kenyan coffee because it had the brightness and the berries that you would expect from a Kenyan coffee, but also a marriage with the Calendar coffees, as those also tend to have a little bit of that honey-like attribute to them. So level 4, that's where I'm placing it. I think it's a little bit more in that sense as opposed to those red florals. Berry fruit, level 4. Once again, I don't think that it's anything that really overly stands out relative to other Kenyan coffees. It's bright in that sense. At times it felt a little bit more candied. And when I was able to get in that slightly maybe gummy worm-like sense sort of taste to it, or that very hard candy, it was definitely at its best. Those tend to be some of my favorite Kenyan coffees that we ever discuss, either that or the ones that come out super peachy. So that right there at that level 4 mark. We'll move on quickly to the level 3s. Citrus, level 3, and I'm actually quite happy usually when we can tone down the citrus on Kenyan coffees, because I don't want it to be that kind of boring, undefined citrus that complements the very tart attributes of those berries. So having that down there at that level 3 is a nice selling point to me on this one. Stone fruit, level 3. I was experiencing a little bit of some peachy qualities to it, but in addition to that, I would say most definitively a plum-like attribute and a little bit more of those darker stone fruit components. And having it scored at that level 3 is a nice little addition to this coffee, which did seem to offer plenty of depth in general, even if it was skewing specifically on one direction for one flavor profile specifically, that of course being those berries, but it was a little bit more diverse of a berry sense to it. So level 3 in that just gives this cup a little bit more. Final thing worth discussing is the body at a level 2, and I feel like the main reason for that is the Chemexes. It's pretty rare for me to get a Kenyan coffee that doesn't score minimum level 3. But this one, as I was making this tasting, I said to myself, not necessarily the most amount of body I've experienced for a Kenyan coffee, so we're going to bump this one down to a level 2. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think it's funny that I picked this coffee up long before we ever had the Kiangoi from Morgon, which ended up second in our 2023 Cafe Box Advent Calendar Blind Taste Test Series, which is to say, I specifically like these Kenyan coffees mostly because of how sweet they turn out to be. And this one was pretty sweet. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's an overly memorable Kenyan coffee that we've had, because we've surprisingly had some really good Kenyan coffees over the last year or so. With that being said, I would say it was a very solid Kenyan coffee because it seems to offer everything I hope for and expect from Kenyan coffees, which is clarity. That's a big one. When it's toning down the savory aspects of it and scoring that level 4, that's already off to a very good start. Really nice sweetness, some great fruit depth, and even though the brightness is at that point where I'm a little bit more indifferent, I think it was made up for by having a little bit more of a candied sweetness as opposed to, we'll just say, that overly defining and strong tart attribute of those berries. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like maybe if you're a little bit more of a me type of Kenyan coffee drinker, which is to say that you look for a little less of those savory components, the brightness isn't necessarily at the forefront, it's not your biggest priority. You seem to skew a little bit more in terms of the sweetness and you're looking for a little bit more of those candied Kenyans, then I feel like this is a good place to start with this one, especially given that it still does offer that lighter profile and it's going to give you a lot of the classic Kenyan attributes to it. I don't even necessarily think I discussed the hoppiness too much, as it was a little bit of a sticking point early on. Well, with some adjustments, I was able to maybe dilute that and tone that down to what was a little bit more of a preferred coffee for me. But even then, if you're looking for something like that, it does make for an interesting coffee as opposed to being a little bit more one-dimensional of a, this is a very strong, intense, acidic tomato bomb. So take that for what you will. I feel like that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kiangoi wash processed Kenya from Calendar Coffee. Thank you for watching.